Shalom, this is Dr. Dinah, and welcome to Foundations in Torah. This is our last in a series on the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And before I get started on that, I just want to mention I have something very exciting on the website now, www.foundationsintorah.com. You have the ability to download or rent with the video on demand all the teachings that I have. So if you go to the website right there on the homepage, and you don't have to be a member to have access to the video on demand, but you can just click on there and go right into the page, and all the teachings are there. They're available, as I said, to rent or to purchase as a download. So I'd encourage you to do that. I also would encourage you to sign up, become a member, and to the very least, you can get the newsletter that goes out each week. And basically, I've been going through the entire scripture, the Torah portions, that is, and looking at them as in the context of the temple. So that said, let's move on to the final, really, session dealing with the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I'll just kind of pick it up where I left off last time. And I'd like to just read this. Well, of course, this is a scripture you're all familiar with. Talks about obeying the governing authorities, for there is no authority that is not from God. And this is one of those scriptures I think has caused a lot of heartburn over the years, and depending on the situation. And I think that a real overemphasis on this passage has been what's caused the church to hide inside its walls. So this is the quote from Bonhoeffer. He said that they had never, that is the church, been forced to deal with the boundaries of the scriptural idea of obedience to worldly authorities. Overemphasis has caused the church to hide within its walls. So again, from Bonhoeffer there. And so the overemphasis on it, he says, basically was something inherited from Luther. So the predominant feeling was you resist authority and you resist what God has instituted. And this is really a fine line, a difficult area for us to deal with. And so the church at the time had not dealt with that. Where is the boundary line of that? And they had not really ever dealt with it. And so because of that, and it doesn't appear they really wrestled with it. Bonhoeffer did, but this was a huge problem. And so because of it, they really were afraid to go against the authorities. Of course, by the time Hitler is in power, that would have been a difficult thing. One of the fruits of what tyrants do, and this is also from the book, Bonhoeffer says that the onslaught of inane regulations and unjust laws overwhelmed the confessing church pastors. And one pastor said, "Poor oppressed Christianity is acquiring a greater vitality than I have ever known." So I couldn't help but think something recent that sort of happened for us under the current administration over the last couple of years has signed off, without Congress's approval, something to the tune of 21,000 new regulations, I think since maybe 2011. And apparently that fits on 486,000 pages. So we now have 486,000 pages of regulations, of which none of us know what's in it. So you can pretty well bank on the fact that you are disobeying the law almost every minute of every day if you really wanted to get down to it. So those sort of inane regulations, which is another pattern and symptom of what tyrants do, of what dictatorships and totalitarian governments do, are designed to completely destroy your freedom. And for us, in particular, is our financial freedom. That's what hits us the hardest. Now, we know early Christians stood up against the Caesars, who did in ancient Rome exactly the same thing. And this concept of bureaucracy and regulation, again, is just something that's the pattern of large empires. So the Nazis' approach, really, to the confessing church, and that, of course, is a church that functioned outside the regular Lutheran church, was to pass ever-increasing and ever-tightening regulation. And things like, they finally got to the point where they forbade the reading of intercessory prayer lists from the pulpit. If you can imagine, they revoked all passports. And any collections, the tithes taken up during the service, were considered illegal. So we can pretty well prepare for a ban on a 501c3 status that the church has been given, or an aberration of it in some way. So, and at the time, virtually all communication that the church had was subject to the Nazis' editorial laws. So we're not there yet, of course, but it sure seems like that's the direction that we're headed in. And the natural place where kingdoms and empires end up is that they're controlled by bureaucracies, large, heavy bureaucracies that don't function and that don't make any sense, and the rules that they pass. So certainly we're on the fast track to that. We know that one of the things that Dietrich Bonhoeffer, just as an aside, is that he did face severe bouts of depression. This was one of the things he battled. So in spite of his great writings and his just brilliant mind, he did have to deal with that. And I think you sometimes see that with very brilliant men and women who really sort of function on a level we don't quite understand, but they do deal with things that maybe some of us don't. He also said the war was only showing them a deeper reality that always existed. Because of the war, they could see things as they truly are, and there's probably no better word that said, if you really want to know where people are at, the conditions of war and the pressures that war brings and the destruction and everything that's connected with war is going to reveal who you are as a person, how you react to it, what you do in the face of it. So that is certainly a very true statement. Bonhoeffer goes on to say that in a world where success is the measure and the justification of all things, the figure of him, Yeshua, who was sentenced and crucified, remains a stranger. God was interested, he said, in obedience, not success. And I think that's something we need to really take to heart, especially as these days get darker and darker, and the idea of success and what goes with it becomes more important than justification for everything that is done. Truly, the love of money is the root of all evil. But God is more interested in our obedience than in our success. And of course, he defines success in a completely different way than we do. Bonhoeffer was really, of the time, one of the great encouragers and supporters for the persecuted brethren. Up at this point, the time we're talking now, many had been arrested. One of the things that Bonhoeffer had to reconcile with, because he was part of the plot to kill Hitler, was that very idea. And of course, many didn't agree with him, but he felt, and again, going back to that boundary of where does one uphold the government and the sanctity of that, and that God has raised up and brought down rulers. But he felt that he needed to work inside the system for that end. He said, if one obeyed God and was willing to suffer defeat, and whatever else came one's way, God would show a kind of success the world couldn't even imagine. And I think these are words that we really need to hang on to now, and they're like words from the grave that I think challenge us, but are an encouragement to us, because he, again, has wrestled with all the same things that I do believe folks were going to be wrestling with, certainly in the future. So again, if one obeyed God, that kind of success, the description, identification of God's success functions completely outside the realm of the world's success. There's nothing remotely similar. They're 180 degrees out of phase. And so if we continue to strive for the success of this world and the accolades of this world, we're going to be finding ourselves farther and farther from him. And this was certainly, imagine those folks at that time basically have lost everything. And certainly for the Jewish people that had been living in Germany, life had been good. They had very successful businesses. Of course, many of them were secular, but they were doing well in the society. And then bit by bit, everything was just stripped away, and they were helpless to do anything about it. The system just marginalized them and removed anything that they were attached to. Of course, ultimately they paid with their lives. We hope and pray it doesn't come to that, but it well could. And certainly one of the things that the enemy, we see that same spirit rising up today as we did in Hitler's time. Of course, under Nazism, etc., Hitler was the dominant tyrant. But the same spirit was moving across the land. Of course, it began in Europe. And so we can see the same thing happening today with the Islamic movement. It really is the same spirit that rises up. And where did it set itself? In Europe, once again. And as I'm teaching this, we've had that incident in France where the 10 journalists were murdered. And then we had several policemen, and then some Jewish people in a kosher deli were also murdered as well. And all of that, it's hardly even imaginable that we're seeing the same thing happen in France that we saw, 70 years ago. And so that spirit is rising up once again in all of Europe. And recently, Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, has really made the statement, encouraged all French Jews to return back to their land, come back to the land of Israel, because it's really the only safe place for them. And I do believe that once again, European nations are going to be emptied out of the few Jews that are still left there compared to what once was. What Bonhoeffer went on to say is that the only place where God and the reality of this world are reconciled with each other is in Yeshua. He, of course, called him Jesus, who is the reconciler of this world. And so that, again, these are profound statements. They are very timely, and they were wrestled with and statements made under the crucible and the pressures that came to bear pre-World War II, and then, of course, into the war. And certainly Bonhoeffer has much to tell us. He goes on to say that the evilness of the Nazis could not be defeated by ethics, rules, and principles. God alone could combat it. Under normal circumstances, people are concerned with ideas of right and wrong. But this approach failed under the Nazis. Hitler made the true reality of the human condition. Evil had stepped to the center of the world stage. And we can just go on and rattle and rail on all our little principles and rules and make others try to fit into our own image and likeness. But that doesn't you cannot deal with evil in that way. So you have your morals and your rules and your ethics that you live by. But those things in these kinds of circumstances can't combat evil, because it doesn't even make any sense. Everything is upside down and turned around. Everything is 180 degrees out of phase. And so you walk that line in your moral principles and your high ground, and you try and I see this in the Hebrew Roots community, try to make everyone else and put them in their box of, yes, this is right and this is wrong. But that doesn't work in these kinds of circumstances. And it was an approach that failed under the Nazis, and it is an approach that will fail in the future as well if we come to this. And so the reality of evil in the center of the world is exactly what we're facing now. And many of you know that the things that some of our leaders do make absolutely no sense. That we as believers, and we have the Torah and the scriptures, and we can see right from wrong, and that is our worldview, and that is how we look out from our worldview to make decisions, rational decisions based on common sense. But when everything is upside down, those decisions, that how you walk doesn't really make sense to the other side, if you will. And so because of it, we see that people are unable to see patterns as they truly are. So we recognize, for instance, in the whole Islamic world, that the number one group that's causing all these problems in the world, killing in the name of Allah and destroying everything in their path, are these radical Islamic jihadists. Other religious groups are not doing this. And so we are very clear that there's a pattern here, and yet we see that the world wants to poo-poo all that and basically sanctions the behavior of radical Islam, and it makes absolutely no sense to us. And that's because evil has stepped to the center stage of the world, and it's never going to make any sense. And so what happens is, and what Bonhoeffer talked about, is you become trapped in situations of ethical impossibilities. And that's certainly things I know some of you have faced when you have a choice between. I always think of the story of the movie Sophie's Choice. I couldn't imagine the choice she had to make, a truly ethical impossibility. As she got off the train, she was in Auschwitz with her two babies, her two little children, a boy and a girl, and she had to make a decision which one would live and which one would die. So those are the kinds of ethical impossibilities we are going to find ourselves faced with as evil abounds throughout the world. Bonhoeffer tells us, and it says in the book, that he really dismissed a number of approaches to deal with evil. And this one will really hit home because he said that reasonable people think you can deal with evil with reason. You can deal with evil with reason, and you can discuss and compromise and work out a solution. That's exactly what Neville Chamberlain tried to do. But you can't pull back a structure that has come apart at the joints. And so we find that Niemöller, he was a part of the Confessing Church and a good friend of Bonhoeffer, felt that he could reason with Hitler. Well, you cannot reason with evil. And it's the same thing that we're seeing now with Islamic Jihad. You can't reason with that. That is an approach that will get you nowhere. And so when we see our world leaders with appeasing tyrants like in Iraq and certainly in Syria, etc., we recognize that this is never going to work, and obviously it's clear it hasn't. Bonhoeffer goes on to say those who believe they can face the power of evil with the purity of their will and their principles, these are men of conscience. They become overwhelmed. And they are deceived. They deceive their own conscience in order not to despair. So some retreat into private virtuousness, and they close their ears and their eyes to the injustices all around them. And folks, I think we've pretty well arrived at this place. And this is really the condition of the church. It prides itself on its virtuousness, and it has closed its eyes and ears to the massive amount of injustice around them. And as I mentioned in my last teaching, in session number 5, that the sex slave trade and what it is doing, and just the murder and havoc and barbarity of it, of little girls and young women all over the world, tortured and slain for this. You can choose to close your eyes and ears to it. And that, unfortunately, men of conscience do become overwhelmed by the power of evil. And I pray, folks, for us that we do not, if we don't stand up, and if we don't intercede, and if we don't take a stand, and if we don't push back, there is nobody to do that, and we will all be overwhelmed. And we don't want to be overwhelmed in our consciences, then you can't function. We don't want to be deceived in our conscience either, and we don't want to be moved to despair. And so because of that kind of vulnerability, and we want to just put a hedge of protection around us and our family. But as Bonhoeffer has explained, it's simply not possible to do that. I mean, you can, but then look at the fruit and look at what happens, and then tyrants are able to have their will over everyone. His letters revealed just how tortured they were in knowing when to protest and when to accede, when to go to war and when to take a stance, killing or being killed. The utter evilness of evil showed itself clearly. And isn't that profound? And isn't that exactly what we're all dealing with? And I would have to say, even in my own life, where's the line? Where's that line in the sand that I won't cross over? And I can't say that I even know in my own life. And I'm sure many of you feel the same way. And when push comes to shove, and we're faced with ethical impossibilities, how will we handle it? And we all feel that we have no courage and that we're cowards and we'll just go hide out. And that, I mean, that's a normal response, and I think that's probably how we all feel. These principles that he's talking about, that doesn't really work when you're faced with evil. The only way they can function is in the hands of God. They will eventually be thrown away when they are no longer useful. And again, this explains to me, and in the book it explains how Bonhoeffer was able to join the conspiracy to kill Hitler. And because he recognized these principles and ethics, that the walls that he had built around himself were not helping in the situation. He goes on to say, no one has yet believed in God and the kingdom of God. No one has yet heard about the realm of the resurrected and not been homesick from that hour, waiting and looking forward joyfully to being released from bodily existence. And folks, that is where we may well find ourselves. I don't know that many of us have actually reached that point, and maybe those of you who've suffered with grave illnesses and have been tortured in that experience, if you will, maybe you folks probably recognize more so than the rest of us that the realm of the resurrected is the home where you want to be, and that you are looking forward joyfully to being released from this body. And of course, Paul spoke of that glowingly, and that it is one of the messages, important messages of the New Testament, that yes, we're in this world, we're not of it. Yes, we are constrained by the laws of nature and the things of this world that come against us, but at the same time, the essence of who we are, the spirit of who we are, longs to be in his presence. Bonhoeffer said that death is grace, the greatest gift of grace that God gives to people who believe in him. That is death as grace. It is the gateway to our homeland, the tabernacle of joy, the everlasting kingdom of peace. He goes on to say, to do the will of God, to do it radically, courageously, and joyfully. May God in his mercy lead us through times, but above all, may he lead us to himself. And they all said, amen. So his solution in the end for all of this is that we do the will of God, and that above all and everything that we do, may everything that we do in our time with him lead us to him. And in our own strength, we have no courage. In our own strength, we could say we have no joy. But as we draw close to him, and I mean really close to him, that when it's real and the power of the Spirit moves upon us, and then we experience, and then we are given that kind of courage that you simply cannot summon that up or by willpower somehow be courageous. It has to be the essence of who you are, that the fruit of the Spirit is moving mightily in your life and is manifest in that way. Otherwise, it's not possible. So again, Bonhoeffer was at the heart of this conspiracy to kill Hitler, and he lended a tremendous amount of emotional support, as you can well imagine, and he encouraged those who were involved. And he said the idea one could ever go back to the way things were before was really a false premise. It simply wasn't possible. There was the last person to see him alive was the camp doctor at Flossenburg, who saw him through the door kneeling on the floor praying to his God, and in a way that it was clear that God heard his prayer. And this was April 9th, 1945. And the doctor made an interesting comment. He said, I have hardly ever seen a man die so entirely submissive to the will of God. Let me read that again. I have hardly ever seen a man die so entirely submissive to the will of God. Now remember, Bonhoeffer's a young guy. He's in his 40s. And I can't even imagine those 15 years of his life leading up to World War II and then all through World War II. It says at the time the crematorium wasn't working, so the bodies of the hanged men were burned in piles. And he said that he had the honor to be joined to millions of other victims of the Third Reich. And it was 2 weeks later for the day that the Allies marched into Flossenburg. And so what can you say? Bonhoeffer knew it was a privilege to be allowed by God to partake of the sufferings of the Jews who had died in this place before him. And so are we at the same place? And we find it a privilege to take on the suffering of those, the innocent and the victims around us. So I hope this has been a blessing to you, and it's been a joy to teach it, and I hope I'll see you again. Thank you. Shalom.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hoogie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.
Yeah, but can you tell the difference between a winner and a loser? Between the righteous and unrighteous? Huh? Can you?
Boy, sometimes no. Sometimes the lines are pretty blurred. I wish I was as knowledgeable and as insightful that I could. You know, we follow different people and different teachings throughout our life, and only to come up short and disappointed too many times. You know, how many times did you change your mind going through Christianity and the different denominations, and then into messianics, and from one teacher to another, and even listen to Lamb Radio. I mean, that's one of the great things about Mark, is he has different perspectives, and you can get a smidgen of this and a smattling of that, and
right. And a bicar, baby, even if you need it or not.
Yeah.
It's a giant hodgepodge of everything.
Yeah. Well,
you gotta have an Alka-Seltzer commercial.
Pam?
Flop, flop, fizz, fizz. Oh, what do we need to do?